We have the urinary system involving the kidneys as the major organ. And this system, of course, is functioning to filter our blood, and the constant filtration process of our blood plasma ultimately is the source of producing this waste chemical that's called urine and is flushed out of the body. So we notice all of the functions of the urinary system have that relationship with the bloodstream, with the cardiovascular system. So starting from the beginning, just the term micturition, just another term for the process of urination. So the actual removal of urine from the body and all the dissolved waste material within urine. And then looking at all these other traits here, we see regulating the ionic concentration of blood plasma, regulating the pH balance of all of our body fluids, and the direct interaction, of course, is with blood. But blood plasma intermixes with interstitial fluid, with cerebral spinal fluid. So essentially all body fluids that go in. You notice here, since we use our blood plasma to create urine, that has a direct effect on the volume of blood and thus the pressure, of course, in the cardiovascular system. And lastly, looking at the cell types, the formed elements, the kidneys produce a hormone to stimulate increased levels of erythrocyte cells, red blood cells. So all of these have a direct impact on the makeup of that fluid connective tissue blood and indirectly any of our body fluids. And that's just describing it here again. The urinary system, the kidneys in particular, regulates so many factors, so many traits about our blood, whether it be the concentration of the erythrocyte count, the volume of blood in the plasma, the pressure thus in our arteries, the acid base balance, and a way to filter out any excess material, any toxins, any foreign material. And this filtration structure, again, is the kidney itself. And the kidney contains over 1 million of these tubules known as nephrons. And this is the exact structure that filters our plasma and produces urine, are the millions of functioning nephrons that we have. So as far as an organ system, there's just 6 organs. We see the paired kidneys, truly the organ receiving the blood plasma, doing all the filtration process, whereas the remaining organs are now transporting urine out of the body. The paired ureters, the single urinary bladder is now a storage site, and then a single urethra, ultimately the canal to expel urine out of the body. And the entire organ system is found within the abdominal pelvic cavity. And we're going to start in the more superior portion where we see the location of the kidneys. And the kidneys are in the more superior abdominal cavity. However, since they're further to the dorsal end, more posterior, the very specific term for that area, the retroperitoneal space, this is the dorsal portion of the abdominal cavity. So that's where we're located here, giving you the vertebrae, right, as a reference for the span of the kidneys. And we see that there's a slight difference in the position of the two kidneys. The right kidney just being slightly more inferior due to the left kidney shape. And it's really accommodating the shape of the liver. If we make a little sketch, and we'll see a figure in just a moment. But the right side of the liver is larger, and to accommodate, the right kidney is slightly inferior when compared to the placement of the left kidney. The kidneys, these are now an example of organs that they do not have a serous membrane. There's no visceral or parietal membrane. It's not necessary. The stomach, the heart, the lungs, these are all organs that are expanding and constricting, changing shape. So they need that visceral membrane. Whereas we see here for a kidney, again, an organ that's not dynamically expanding and contracting its shape, it just simply has layers of connective tissue protecting and supporting this organ without the need of a serous secretion. So if we start here, right on the surface of the kidney, There's this is called a capsule, and several organs that lack serous membranes just have a simple layer of collagen known as the capsule. Surrounding that renal capsule, again, adipose is always a great protective cushion anywhere we find it in the body. And to give more support to adipose tissue, there's again more collagen running through the fat, known as a renal fascia. And we'll go ahead and take a look at an illustration for these traits here. So again, showing that difference slightly, again, the right kidney just being slightly inferior to accommodate that larger right lobe of the liver. And with this transverse section, you notice here, right at the first lumbar vertebra, we can see the renal capsule right on the surface of the kidney. Here represented in yellow, you can see all of this adipose tissue. And running through the fat is where we see that renal fascia. So truly, it's large amounts of connective tissue, right? Adipose and collagen are definitely connective tissue that support and protect the kidneys within that posterior retroperitoneal space. You notice posterior to the digestive organs and their placement. So now getting to the organ itself, deep to that renal capsule, there's two major areas to the kidney. And we see the terms just the cortical region, the medullary region, just simply meaning superficial for the cortex, the medulla, the deeper section. And many organs have this description. You might remember, of course, the cerebral cortex in the brain, the cerebellar cortex in the brain, and there's many examples. And we'll see the importance of the cortex versus the medulla in the kidney. And again, the urinary system's function closely interacts with the cardiovascular system, with our blood especially. So here we see the pathway of blood supply. And ultimately notice all of this circulating blood has to get down to the filtration structure itself. So the million plus nephrons that are within the kidney that do the job of filtering the plasma. So let's move on to this section. So we already said this is now the unit of physiology doing the function for the kidneys. Again, over 1 million of these per kidney. And keep in mind, of course, there's the paired kidneys and a healthy functioning body. And it's now the job of the nephron itself is to receive, of course, the plasma that transfers from our blood. And ultimately, the plasma will be filtered within the nephrons. Most of that plasma will be reabsorbed, meaning returned back to the bloodstream. And per cycle through a nephron, only a small amount of fluid that exits the nephron is now known as urine. But this is a constant process. The kidneys are functioning constantly. The nephrons are constantly producing a small amount of urine. And of course, over time, that collects and builds up in the bladder. So to start the process, we want to see where does the blood plasma enter or filter into the nephron. So you notice we see here an arteriole leading down towards a distinct and unique type of capillary known as this glomerular capillary. And this is the typical site for the plasma to now filter and enter into the nephron. So we have this term here known as a renal corpuscle. Deep inside the renal corpuscle is this distinct, unique glomerular capillary that we'll take a look at. However, the superficial portion of the renal corpuscle goes by multiple names: a Bowman's capsule, parietal epithelium. That's the more superficial portion. But both of these together, parietal epithelium, glomerular capillary together, make this renal corpuscle the entrance for plasma into the nephron. So starting there at the glomerulus, either called glomerulus or glomerular capillary. So again, a capillary network allowing for the transfer of material out of the cardiovascular system, and in this case, directly filtering plasma into the nephrons. And this starting process here is selective. We'll take a look at the structure of the glomerulus itself, but there are various factors that are in our blood that would never filter into the nephron in usual cases. So for example, our blood cells, our erythrocytes, should not be entering into the nephrons, but truly the plasma, dissolved material, small proteins that can filter in, will pass through the layers of the glomerulus. And to take a look at this now, this unique type of glomerular capillary has three distinct layers to it. And the first one starts out as a familiar fenestrated capillary. And of course, here we are in the kidneys seeing the fenestrated capillary. So this is a type of capillary that has the medium-sized pores. So the pores within the capillary wall allow for that flow of plasma out. But now how the fenestrated capillary is modified by having these two additional layers. So surrounding the fenestrated capillary, there's now a layer known as the basement membrane. And this layer here, now you notice, blocks the entry of larger plasma proteins. And there are various plasma proteins, albumins, immunoglobulins, and the larger proteins that are in your blood and need to be in your blood are blocked from filtering into the nephron. And then now surrounding the basement membrane, what's known as the glomerular epithelium, visceral epithelium is another name for it, and it's made of these podocyte cells. So these podocytes are collectively the visceral epithelium, covers, you notice, the majority of the basement membrane. However, the exposed sections that are not covered by the podocytes, the gaps, of course, that are still exposed, these are known as filtration slits. And the overall concept is, in order for something to transfer from our plasma into the nephron, that material has to first filter through the fenestrated capillary. It has to filter through the basement membrane and filter through the filtration slits to enter into the nephron. So just a quick look back at that slide on a fenestrated capillary. We covered this from the cardiovascular system, the blood vessel chapter, and here we are, of course, in the kidneys with these fenestrated capillaries. However, that's just the first layer of the glomerular capillary. So that fenestrated capillary is then modified by having a layer of basement membrane surrounding that, and then of course the surrounding podocyte. However, the exposed areas not covered by the podocyte are these filtration slits, and we can see all of these layers form that structure of the glomerular capillary. So a modified fenestrated capillary is a glomerular capillary. So at this point, we've just been looking just at the entrance section, entering into the nephron. And here we're seeing now the rest of the nephron structure, all of the tubules seen here, and all of these distinct segments. However, this is not a realistic portrayal of a nephron. It's stretched out so we can see all of the different components. So again, the proximal side, the entrance, beginning with the renal corpuscle. There's the deeper internal glomerular capillary, and then the external portion, the superficial portion. One name for it is Bowman's capsule. So these two together make the renal corpuscle. So now we're seeing a realistic portrayal of a nephron. You notice the tube is highly coiled up, and it's surrounded by a number of capillaries. Because again, the urinary system is directly interacting with the cardiovascular system, with the blood, and there's a large network of surrounding capillaries directly interacting with the nephron. So to take a step back, we had the terms introduced earlier, the cortex, the superficial portion of the kidney, versus the deeper medulla. The medulla is made of the sum of all of these different darker pyramid sections. The renal pyramids collectively make the deeper medulla. And we can see that the nephron starts out in the cortex, the renal corpuscle. These are only located in the cortex of the kidney. And the rest of the nephron tubule, you see how it descends into the medulla, then back out to the cortex, and then again deeper into the medulla. So spanning across the superficial and the deeper sections is where these nephrons are located. And in fact, we have two different populations of nephrons. So we have what's known as a cortical nephron, and the name really makes sense. You notice how it sits up much closer to the surface, especially the location of the renal corpuscle. This is the more common type, and we want to take a look at this percentage here. So this more common, typical type of nephron in our body, a cortical nephron. And another distinction about it, it's closer to the surface. It is the larger majority. And a third trait is, if we look at this section here in particular, this long descending and ascending portion, it's known as a nephron loop or a loop of Henle, and it's much shorter for cortical nephrons. Whereas in now contrast, what's known as juxtamedullary, you notice sitting much deeper in the renal corpuscles, much deeper in, closer to the medulla. It is the smaller minority, and it has a much longer nephron loop. And just those small differences in their anatomy, of course, differences in anatomy lead to differences in physiology, as we've been saying. Now, it's beyond the area of the renal corpuscle. We notice the next portion of the tube is now called a proximal convoluted tubule. And it's at this point, plasma is transferring from the glomerular capillary, transferring into that Bowman's capsule, passing along to the proximal convoluted tubule. And it's right in this very initial segment of the nephron. Most of the work of reabsorption will occur in this proximal convoluted tubule. And that's due to the fact that the epithelial cells in the proximal convoluted tubules, the epithelial cells, contain microvilli, giving increased surface area, more contact surface. And the term reabsorption, this means that fluid that's now inside of the nephron, at this point is known as filtrate. And when we reabsorb filtrate, reabsorption means material inside of the nephron gets transferred back to the cardiovascular system. Anything that we reabsorb is going to be transferred back to our bloodstream, and we're going to retain it in our body. Whereas fluid that passes completely through the length of the nephron and out the other side, any fluid expelled out the very distal end, that fluid is now called urine. So now, still in the area of the renal corpuscle, there's a cluster of cells known as a juxtaglomerular complex or juxtaglomerular apparatus. And we see that this is commonly called JG apparatus. The JG apparatus produces these two factors. We notice one is a enzyme that, of course, is going to catalyze and speed up a series of chemical reactions. And ultimately, the goal of this renin release and this cascade of enzymatic activity, it leads to reduced urine volume. So reduced production of urine, or another way to say that is less fluid is in the urine, and more water is retained in our body to keep us hydrated. Whereas the hormone erythropoietin, so a hormone, is produced from this same JG apparatus, and a hormone, of course, entering the blood, stimulating in our bone marrow, increased production of red blood cells. So just seeing another way that, of course, the kidneys regulate our blood, the red blood cell count, or in this case, the plasma volume. And to view that here, again, we're still in that area of the renal corpuscle, and we see the cells right along the surrounding arterioles here, collectively make up this area of the JG apparatus. So again, that renal corpuscle has the external Bowman's capsule, is how I learned it, or parietal epithelium. The internal structure, the glomerular capillary with its 3 layers, the fenestrated capillary, the basement membrane, and then again, the podocyte cells collectively make that visceral epithelium. Material that filters in to the nephron passes through those layers to enter into the proximal convoluted tubule. And then reabsorption occurring along the rest of the nephron will return most of that fluid back to the bloodstream. So here's the overall concept of what's occurring with the function of the nephrons. We're circulating blood, of course, to the glomerulus, that capillary, filtering it into the nephron. And now the process of reabsorption is selective. So only certain chemicals, and of course there's a saturation, a limitation point to how much can be reabsorbed back to our cardiovascular system. So in the levels and the amounts of certain chemicals that we want to retain in our body, those are selectively reabsorbed and returned right back to the cardiovascular system. Whereas any other chemicals or excess amount of material that we cannot reabsorb, that now completely passes through the lymph and the nephron, and any fluid that's expelled out the opposite end of the nephron, that's now called urine, that will ultimately be excreted from the body. And this is a constant process, 2 kidneys, a few million nephrons, constantly doing this. And when we're at rest, our parasympathetic nervous system stimulates increased function of renal filtration. And again here, FYI again, but to help us understand this, getting into a tiny bit of physiology, we're starting here at the glomerular capillary, and that's the term filtration, transferring plasma from our bloodstream into the nephron. That's starting the process. Reabsorption again, when we transfer filtrate, fluid that's in the nephron, getting returned back to the bloodstream. And you can notice here all along the nephron, these arrows pointing out and towards these capillaries. So this is showing reabsorption occurring along multiple segments of the nephron. And then finally, excretion. This is truly the production of urine. So any fluid that completely passes out the distal end of the nephron, that excreted fluid is now known as urine. And it's made of the filtered plasma and any dissolved material that we just never reabsorbed. So getting back to our information, there's a particular hormone known as ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and this has a direct impact on the nephron function and thus urine production. So taking a look at ADH as a whole, it's produced in that small but important area of the brain, the hypothalamus. This is one of those many functions that it does. And specifically from the hypothalamus via the infundibulum and pituitary gland, ADH is released from an area called the neurohypophysis. The neurohypophysis is another name for posterior pituitary. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, or the fancy name, neural hypophysis. From here, ADH is entered into the bloodstream. It circulates around the body, and one of its effects, in this case, has a direct effect on the distal end of the nephron, known as a collecting duct. And the purpose now is affecting the reabsorption, specifically of water molecules. So with the production and release of ADH, the collecting duct now is signaled to transfer more and more water. The aquaporin channels, they're called, the water reabsorption channels in the collecting duct. They increase their function to reabsorb larger amounts of water, and this is the typical condition. So meaning water that's within the collecting duct is going to be transferred out of the collecting duct and back to the bloodstream to keep us hydrated, to maintain proper levels of water in our bloodstream. And just an interesting note about alcohol here, we see the impact of alcohol drinking. One of the many effects is now this decrease in ADH production. That means a decrease in water reabsorption at the collecting ducts. Less water is reabsorbed back to the bloodstream. More water is now routed to the urine. And that's what we're going to follow now. So all along the length of the nephron, material is being reabsorbed, water, solutes, sugar, and again, any of that fluid that passes completely through now at this point is known as urine. And all the remaining organs of the system, their job is just simply transporting the urine, expelling it out of the body. So now that moves us along to the remaining organs. Again, the ureters, just simply transporting urine down to the bladder, storage in the urinary bladder, and the path of excretion out the urethra. So taking a look at the ureters themselves, again, paired ureters. They're spanning from an area called the renal pelvis, which is this funnel-shaped region on the medial side of the kidneys. And starting from the renal pelvis, the ureters then taper down and then travel and connect to the posterior side of the bladder. And in fact, right where the ureters connect to the bladder, there are these valve structures. And of course, valves keep fluid flowing one direction. That would prevent urine that's in the bladder from somehow flowing back up the ureters. And the way that that works is taking a look at the valves themselves. When the muscle of the urinary bladder is contracting, so this muscle layer is contracting, that's when these valves shut, and the only way for the urine to flow is out the urethra. Whereas when the muscle of the bladder is relaxed, the urinary bladder's muscle is relaxed, the valves are open, and that allows for urine, of course, to flow down and flow into the bladder. This is an area that has that rare type of epithelial tissue we discussed some time ago. So it's known as transitional epithelium. Transitional is a stratified type of epithelium, and there's variation in the shape of the cells. And the urinary system, the ureters, the urinary bladder, are really the few areas that have this transitional epithelium, as well as the ureters themselves, when viewed under the microscope. Beyond the layer of transitional epithelium, there's also a layer of smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle with its visceral motor control helps to propel and push urine down towards the bladder. So that's the next organ, the urinary bladder, truly just this pouch for the short-term storage of urine as it's being collected. The kidneys are constantly producing urine, and we need this pouch now to store it. So this first feature within the urinary bladder, this area known as a trigone, and this area is formed between the three different canals leading in and out of the bladder. And just a quick sketch, two of them, of course, coming from each ureter, and then the third canal between the urethra. So it's that area between the three known as this trigone. And a noteworthy issue is this is a common site where a UTI, a urinary tract infection, will begin by first infecting the trigone and then has the potential to spread even back towards the kidneys. The muscle now within the urinary bladder, the muscle that provides the force for micturition or urination, you notice is now this layer of dense, three layers of smooth muscle tissue. In fact, the three layers themselves, circular muscle and two layers of longitudinal muscle. But collectively, it's known as the detrusor muscle. And this muscle now provides the force and the pressure for the process of micturition to expel urine out of the bladder. So looking at the fact that this is made of smooth muscle, of course, smooth muscle primarily responding to stretch of the tissue, to visceromotor signaling. However, the process of urination or micturition can be controlled at the conscious level, and we will see that there is some skeletal muscle with that somatic motor control. However, the skeletal muscle is found along the urethra, the actual exit canal. So here's a much nicer figure showing the urinary bladder. And again, you can see the two ureters that now deliver urine in via the valve structures that are here. That funnel of the trigone being labeled. The three layers of smooth muscle collectively known as a detrusor muscle. And again, with the autonomic nervous system, the visceral motor control, specifically the parasympathetic division, that will stimulate the detrusor muscle to contract. And that contraction is the force to expel urine out of the urinary bladder. However, right at the base of the urinary bladder, there's now a valve, this first valve, known as an internal urethral sphincter. Internal always means deep. So the internal, the deeper urinal sphincter is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So this visceral motor control, this now allows to constrict the valve. And when we're in a more active state with the sympathetic nervous system, that will act to constrict the sphincter to prevent urination. However, both of these are composed of smooth muscle and thus have autonomic function or visceral motor function. And we see now it's further along the length of the urethra that there's now the external urethral sphincter. And this is the one composed of skeletal muscle. This is the one that now can be controlled at the conscious level to prevent urination. And that's what we're spelling out here. The last organ for the system, the urethra, this is the canal for the release of urine. And we just pointed out the two different sphincters. So the internal urethral sphincter, composed of smooth muscle, so having that visceral motor control, specifically the sympathetic nervous system. The second sphincter, the external urethral sphincter, composed of skeletal muscle. So of course that's the somatic motor, the voluntary motor control. And finishing now by taking a look at the different sexes, because there's major differences between the urethra in men versus women. So in the female anatomy, there's a much shorter length to the female urethra, and it's used solely as a urinary organ. So a single purpose for the release of urine. Whereas in male anatomy, there's a much longer canal to the male urethra. And the previous figure that we just saw was specifically a male urethra. And in fact, it has 3 distinct segments. And this is due to the fact that the male urethra passes through other reproductive organs as well. And we see it has this dual purpose function. So it's used for the release of urine, and also, as I mentioned, passing through reproductive organs, it has that reproductive function. And we can take a look at this. So we notice the urinary bladder, and again, this is a male bladder illustrated. The first section of the male urethra passes through the prostatic urethra segment, that first of the 3 segments, and it gets the name because it's inside and within the prostate gland, a male reproductive organ. The second portion of the male urethra, you see the labeling here, membranous urethra. And again, it's right in this area we find another set of male reproductive organs. So we'll come back to this detail, the distinct regions in the reproductive system. But again, in men, it has this dual purpose nature. So taking a look at the female pelvis section, again, it's solely a urinary organ. There's the position of the urinary bladder, the canal for the release of urine, the urethra itself. So it functions here in women as solely a urinary organ. Whereas in men, to see this figure again, there's the urinary bladder. We just discussed the prostate gland. And now here's another gland, another male reproductive organ that's right here by the second portion of the male urethra. And then, of course, the rest of the urethra passing through the penis, the male genitalia. So those 3 distinct segments will be covered in the reproductive system. But in general, there's the production of urine that has to pass through the urethra to be released. And from the testes, the male gonad, there's production of the spermatozoa, the male gamete, sex cells, that also pass through ultimately the same canal.